They all mocked Ethan Cole, the skinny newcomer, certain he'd never survive life in Dusterville. Roy Bennett, loud and ruthless, made sure every man laughed louder, eager to see him break under humiliation. But fate gave Ethan a chance no one expected. One wild hunt, one impossible burden, and a single act of grit that silenced every jeer. Just wait until you hear how this frail-looking cowboy turned the tables and why justice at last had the final word. Dusterville lay like a forgotten speck on the endless horizon of Texas, a place where every man's worth was measured by the weight he could carry, the cattle he could tame, or the game he could bring back from the wild. The saloon was the heart of the town, a smoky, loud room where sweat and laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses. It was here on a blistering afternoon that Ethan Cole first appeared. Tall but impossibly thin, he looked like the wind itself could knock him over. His long coat hung loose on his shoulders, his boots were worn from miles of travel, and his hat, faded and patched more than once, spoke of a life that hadn't seen much comfort. People in Dusterville noticed everything, and newcomers were always tested. Within minutes, whispers rippled through the room. The regulars were men built by hard labor, ranchers with arms like tree trunks and hunters who spent weeks tracking wild hogs across the thorny brush. To them, Ethan was something of a joke, a lanky figure standing uncertainly near the door, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his eyes quietly scanning the room. They laughed before he even said a word. Roy Bennett, a broad-shouldered cowboy with a booming voice and a mean streak that he wore like a badge of honor, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Look at that," he said loudly, making sure the whole saloon could hear. "A stiff breeze will send him rolling down the street." The room erupted in laughter, glasses raised, boots stomping the wooden floorboards. Ethan didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that silence was stronger than any comeback. His gaze stayed steady, calm on the surface, but inside him burned the slow fire of someone who had been underestimated too many times. His father's words came back to him. "Don't waste your breath on fools, son. Let your actions do the talking." Ethan knew he wasn't built like these men, but he hadn't come for their approval. He came for something deeper, a chance to carve his place in land that demanded respect from everyone who dared step foot on it. He walked toward the bar, his steps measured, the floor creaking under his boots. The bartender, an older man with gray whiskers and tired eyes, gave him a quick nod, but Ethan could feel the weight of every stare in the room pressing on his back. He ordered water, not whiskey, which brought another round of snickers from the corner table where Roy and his crew sat. "Water?" one of them sneered. "You sure you're in the right place, friend? This ain't no schoolhouse." More laughter rolled out, but Ethan didn't look their way. He sipped the water slowly, set the glass down, and let the noise wash over him like dust in the wind. Roy wasn't satisfied. Men like him never were. He thrived on making others smaller so he could stand taller. He stood towering over the others and walked across the room until he was just a few steps from Ethan. "You lost, stranger?" he asked, his tone a mockery wrapped in a smile. "These parts aren't for dreamers. Takes muscle to survive here. Takes guts. You got any?" He leaned closer, his breath heavy with drink. Ethan's eyes finally rose to meet his, quiet, unwavering, steel hidden behind the calm. For the first time, Roy felt the smallest flicker of unease, though he would never admit it. "I'm not here to impress anyone," Ethan said softly, his voice steady, almost too quiet for the rest of the saloon to hear. "I came here to work. That's all." Simple words, but they hung in the air longer than any insult. The laughter slowed. Even Roy blinked as if thrown off by the lack of fear. For a moment, silence stretched between them. And in that silence, something shifted. Small but undeniable. Ethan wasn't a man who fought with words. He was the kind of man who carried his storms inside until the moment came to let them out. The saloon noise returned, but different now, less like roaring and more like nervous murmurs. Roy gave a short laugh, but it sounded forced. "We'll see," he muttered, stepping back. Ethan turned away, picked up his glass, and took another drink. To most, it looked like nothing had changed. But to those who paid attention, Ethan had just passed his first test in Dusterville. Not by shouting, not by swinging, but by holding his ground. And though they still laughed, deep down the seed of doubt had been planted. Maybe, just maybe, the skinny cowboy wasn't as fragile as he looked. The morning sun rose hot over the wide plains, and the dust from the corrals already hung heavy in the air by the time Ethan Cole walked out to the cattle pens. The men were gathering for the day's work, ropes coiled neatly on their belts, boots caked in dirt from years of breaking in stock. Ethan, still new to their rhythm, carried his own rope clumsily over one shoulder. His lean frame made him look more like a boy playing cowboy than one of them, and the smirks on their faces showed they expected a show of failure before noon. Roy Bennett leaned against the fence rail, his hat tipped low and a grin spread wide. He had no real reason to dislike Ethan, but men like Roy fed on easy targets. To him, Ethan's arrival was the perfect stage for mockery. "Don't blink, boys," he called, loud enough to echo across the corral. "You might miss him falling." The men chuckled, some shaking their heads, others already tying off ropes, waiting for the inevitable. The task was simple in theory: guide the restless young bull into the far pen. Simple for men who had grown up doing it. For Ethan, who had spent more time on lonely trails than in the ring with heavy cattle, it was a challenge. He tightened his grip on the rope, steadying his breath as the bull snorted and kicked up dirt, the animal's dark eyes flashing with defiance. Ethan stepped forward, moving in a half circle the way he had seen the others do, his hat pulled low to shade the glare. He swung the rope, but the loop came down clumsy and wide, missing by feet. The men roared with laughter. The bull seized the moment, lowering its head and charging. Ethan tried to dodge, but his timing faltered. In one brutal second, the animal's shoulder caught him squarely and knocked him flat into the dirt. Dust exploded around him, the ground hard beneath his back. A chorus of jeers followed instantly. Boots pounded the fence rails, men hollering in delight. "This pup can't even hold a rope," Roy shouted, nearly doubled over with laughter. His voice carried sharp and cutting, meant to dig deeper than the fall itself. Ethan lay there for a moment, the wind half knocked from him, staring at the endless sky above. The heat pressed down, his chest rising with effort. Every instinct told him to stay down, to avoid the humiliation of standing again in front of all those mocking eyes. But another voice spoke louder inside him, quiet, steady, the same one that had guided him the day before. "Stand up, always stand up," his father's voice again. Ethan pushed his palms into the dirt, forcing his legs beneath him. Dust clung to his shirt, his hands trembled, but he rose step by step until he was standing once more. The laughter dimmed slightly. Some of the men expected him to quit, to throw down the rope and walk away, but Ethan bent, retrieved the line, and reset it across his hands. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, yet his eyes, pale and clear under the brim of his hat, held something unexpected: resolve. Not the fire of anger, but the steady glow of someone who refused to yield. Not everyone missed it. Among the raucous voices was one that stayed silent: Tom Harris. The old cowboy leaned on his saddle near the fence, his weathered face unreadable at first. He had spent decades watching men come and go across these plains, most breaking under the weight of hard labor and harder scorn. When he caught Ethan's eyes, he saw no fear, no plea for mercy, only a stubborn willpower. Tom knew that look. It belonged to men who carried storms inside, men who might bend but never fully break. Roy scoffed again, waving dismissively. "Get out of the pen, Skinny. You'll scare the cattle worse than the coyotes do." The others laughed, though not as loud as before. Something in Ethan's persistence unsettled them, though they'd never admit it. Ethan gave no answer. He shifted his grip, rolled his shoulders, and faced the bull once more. Every muscle in his frame ached, but still he moved forward, calmer now, watching the animal with sharp focus. The bull tossed its head, but didn't charge this time. Ethan circled patiently, rope steady, his boots dragging dust in a slow arc. He didn't catch it, not yet, but the laughter faded into uneasy quiet. This wasn't the show they had expected. They wanted to see a quitter, someone they could dismiss and forget by sunset. Instead, they were watching a man who refused to give them that satisfaction. When the corral finally calmed, the men drifted back to their tasks, their jokes thinner, forced. Tom remained a moment longer, tipping his hat just slightly in Ethan's direction before walking away. That small gesture was worth more than a dozen cheers. Ethan stayed behind, rope in hand, dirt still clinging to his clothes, but his heart steadier than when he started. He hadn't won, not yet, but he hadn't been broken. And that, in Dusterville, was the first real step toward respect. The fire burned low that evening, its glow casting long, restless shadows across the circle of men gathered near the corrals. Sparks floated upward into the darkening Texas sky, vanishing against a blanket of stars. The day's labor had left the cowboys worn but restless, and as they leaned back on saddles or sat cross-legged in the dirt, the talk turned, as it often did, to hunting. It was not only work for them, but proof of who belonged in this unforgiving land. To ride out, track a beast, and return with its weight slung across your shoulders was the highest measure of grit a man could show. Roy Bennett, with his boots propped near the flames and his hat tipped at a careless angle, was quick to seize the moment. His smirk was sharp in the firelight, and his voice, heavy with mockery, cut through the easy chatter. "Why don't we let our skeleton in boots have a try this time?" he said, jerking his chin toward Ethan. "Maybe that hog'll laugh so hard at him he'll fall over before anyone fires a shot." The men roared at the remark, their laughter carrying far into the night air, echoing across the quiet plains. It was the kind of laughter meant to wound, sharp and prolonged, feeding off the pack's need to keep one man lower than the rest. Ethan sat a little apart from the circle, his long legs drawn in, his elbows resting on his knees. The firelight flickered across his face, but he did not lift his head when the jeers rolled over him. He listened, silent and still, while the others found amusement in his expense. Inside, though, his chest tightened. It was not shame that burned in him, but something far heavier, a quiet promise he carved into his own heart with every mocking word. They believed he was weak, and maybe tonight it looked that way, but one day, when the chance came, he would answer them without raising his voice. And when that day came, the laughter would stop. Tom Harris watched him through the haze of smoke. The older cowboy, his face lined by years of sun and hardship, had said little during the evening, preferring the company of silence to crude jokes. Yet as Roy's laughter rang loudest, Tom's gaze rested on Ethan. He saw the way the young man's jaw tightened, not in anger but in quiet determination. Tom had seen that look before, in men who didn't fight back with words, who didn't swing fists to win fleeting respect. Those were the men who carried something deeper, a resolve that could endure humiliation until the time was right to prove itself. The conversation drifted back to hunting stories, each man eager to outdo the next with tales of close calls and heavy kills. The image of the wild hog loomed large in their talk. A beast said to weigh as much as a man and more, with tusks that could rip through brush and courage enough to face down hunters. The fire crackled and the men's voices grew louder, their stories embellished with every retelling. Still, the earlier jab at Ethan lingered in the air, hanging over the circle like smoke that refused to clear. Ethan's hands tightened around the small tin cup he held. He lifted his gaze briefly to the fire, watching how the flames licked at the wood, consuming it slowly, steadily. That was how he felt inside, quiet on the surface but burning beneath. He had no intention of rising to their bait. Words were cheap in a place like Dusterville. What mattered was what a man did when the wilderness tested him. He knew the day would come soon, and when it did, every sneer, every laugh, every cruel nickname would turn to silence. Roy leaned back, clearly pleased with himself, his laughter still bubbling now and then as he retold the joke to whoever would listen. For him, Ethan was nothing but an easy target, a way to keep his dominance in the group unquestioned. But Ethan didn't even glance in his direction. He stared instead into the flames, his expression calm, almost detached. Only he knew what stirred beneath that quiet exterior, a vow not spoken, but stronger than any insult. The night grew colder, and the men eventually stretched out on their bedrolls, the fire crackling down to embers. Laughter faded into snores, and the prairie fell into silence. Ethan lay awake longer than the others, staring at the dark sky above. He thought of the coming hunt, of the chance it held, and of the weight of their doubt pressing down on him. He did not hate them for their laughter. It was the nature of men to mock what they did not understand. But he carried something they could not see, something they would learn soon enough. He closed his eyes, and before sleep took him, he repeated to himself the silent promise he had made by the fire. One day, they will stop laughing. When the laughter of the others had faded into the distance and the glow of the fire was no longer. Reaching his place at the edge of camp, Ethan found himself alone with the silence of the prairie. The air had cooled, the dry grass rustled in the evening breeze, and the sky above bled with the last streaks of crimson from the setting sun. He sat down on a fallen log, shoulders hunched, his hands resting loosely on his knees. For a long moment he simply breathed, letting the quiet seep into him after a day of jeers and bruises. Then with slow care he reached inside his pack and pulled out the one possession that carried more weight than anything else he owned. A worn knife with a wooden handle, its edges dulled by years of use. It had belonged to his father. The knife was not beautiful, not polished like the gleaming rifles or the decorated spurs that some men in Dusterville flaunted. It was simple, carved for work, not for show. Ethan turned it over in his hand, feeling the grooves his father's fingers had worn into the handle. He remembered the way his father would sit on their small porch back home, using that same knife to carve wood, to mend tools, to cut twine after long days in the field. The man had been no warrior, no hunter of legends, just a quiet farmer who worked the soil until his hands cracked and his back bent. But there had been strength in him. Strength that didn't come from bulk or muscle, but from the way he never quit, no matter how harsh the season or how empty the cupboards became. As the last light of the sun sank below the horizon, Ethan could almost hear his father's voice, steady and low. The same words he had spoken countless times when Ethan struggled as a boy. Strength isn't in muscle, son. It's in the heart. Muscle tires, muscle fades. But the heart, if it's steady, it carries you further than you think you can go. Those words had always seemed like comfort back then. Something to ease the sting of being smaller, leaner, weaker than the boys around him. Now, under the vast Texas sky, they felt less like comfort and more like truth. He wasn't built like Roy Bennett or the other men who mocked him around the fire. He couldn't outmatch them in sheer force, but he could endure. He could keep moving when others gave up. That, he realized, was a weapon of its own. He closed the knife gently, slipping it back into its sheath, and set it across his lap. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where the colors shifted from red to purple to the deep blue of night. In that fading light, Ethan allowed himself a moment of reflection. Every insult, every laugh, every push to the dirt was fuel, stacking quietly inside him. He didn't need to shout back. He didn't need to strike back. All he needed was one chance, one moment to show what lived beneath his thin frame. When that moment came, he would not falter. The prairie stretched wide and endless before him, carrying the sounds of coyotes far in the distance and the faint creak of wind through the wooden fences of the corral. It was a land that respected no one at first glance, a land that only yielded to those who proved themselves again and again. Ethan knew he had not yet earned that respect, but he also knew he had the patience to wait and the resolve to act when the time was right. He ran a hand over the knife once more before tucking it back into his pack, a ritual as much as a motion. To anyone else it was a tool, but to him it was a reminder that strength could be quiet and still, yet unbreakable. Standing, he brushed the dust from his coat, squared his shoulders, and looked back toward the glow of the campfires where the others laughed, unaware of the promise he had just renewed. They saw him as fragile, as a man shaped by weakness. But Ethan carried with him the endurance of every hard season his father had survived, the lesson that persistence could outlast ridicule. The stars sharpened overhead, scattered across the black expanse like silver nails hammered into the sky. Ethan breathed deep, steady and calm. He was not in Dusterville for their laughter or for their approval. He was there to prove, to himself above all, that the strength in his heart could carry him through trials heavier than any man imagined. And when that day arrived, when he stood with proof no one could deny, their voices would fall silent. That thought steadied him. Stronger than anger, stronger than fear. Alone in the quiet, Ethan Cole found not despair, but resolve. And with that, he turned back toward camp, ready to face another day. Dawn broke slowly over Dusterville, painting the horizon in shades of pale gold and soft orange. The air was crisp, carrying with it the earthy scent of dew-soaked grass and the distant calls of waking birds. It was the kind of morning that promised both beauty and hardship, for the men of the town were preparing for a hunt that would test not just their skill but their endurance. Horses were saddled, rifles checked, ropes coiled tight across saddlebags. The camp, which only hours before had been filled with laughter and careless jokes, now hummed with the quiet energy of purpose. Yet even in that moment of focus, one figure stood apart from the rest, burdened in a way the others were not. Roy Bennett made sure of it. With a grin that carried the same sharpness as a blade, he tossed the heavy provision sack onto Ethan's shoulders. "You can carry this, Skinny," he said, loud enough for the others to hear. "That way, if you can't shoot straight, at least you'll be useful as a pack mule." The men chuckled, some shaking their heads as though it were all harmless banter. But the weight that landed across Ethan's back was no joke. The bag was filled with dried meat, water skins, rope, and cooking gear, heavy enough to slow even the strongest among them. For Ethan, lean and wiry, it pressed against his shoulders like a boulder. He adjusted the strap without complaint, his face calm, his eyes fixed on the tree line ahead where the shadows of the forest still clung thick. Each step he took sent a dull ache into his spine, but he refused to show it. The others mounted their horses with ease, laughter carrying through the morning air, while Ethan kept to the ground, boots sinking slightly into the dirt road as he followed. The rising sun cast his shadow long across the trail, a reminder of the weight he carried not only in the sack, but in the judgment of every man watching him. Roy rode near the front, turning in his saddle now and then to throw barbs back at Ethan. "Don't fall behind, Cole. We don't have all day." His voice was mocking, but beneath it was a challenge, a test meant to grind the newcomer down before the hunt even began. Roy wanted Ethan broken before they reached the woods, humiliated before he ever had the chance to prove himself. But Ethan's silence was unshakable. He kept his gaze forward, breathing steady, his boots crunching against the trail with quiet rhythm. Every step was pain, but within that pain was something he recognized, something he had lived with all his life: endurance. Others could laugh, could boast of strength and swagger, but Ethan had learned that strength wasn't measured by how much you could lift in the moment. It was measured by how far you could keep going when no one believed you could. The company pressed on, the open plains giving way to thicker brush and trees that stretched high above, their leaves shimmering in the newborn light. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, branches swaying, the occasional snap of something moving unseen among the undergrowth. The men talked in low voices, speaking of tracks and routes, recalling past hunts and dangerous encounters. Ethan listened, storing every word, though he remained silent. His role today was not to speak. His role was to observe, to endure, and to wait. As the sun rose higher, sweat rolled down his temples, dampening the collar of his shirt. The sack dug deeper into his shoulders, and every muscle in his back screamed for relief. Still, he pressed on. The others barely noticed his struggle now. They had written him off, convinced he would crumble before the hunt reached its peak. But inside Ethan, a fire burned hotter with each mile. He could feel it in the rhythm of his steps, in the steady beat of his heart. A certainty grew within him, unshakable and strong. His moment was coming. When it did, it would not arrive with warning. It would not come in words or empty promises. It would come in the wild, in the test that no man could fake. Ethan knew this, and he welcomed it. He bore the weight of the provisions not as a punishment, but as preparation. Every ache carved into him was sharpening his resolve. And as the forest closed around them, shadows stretching long and cool, Ethan tightened his grip on the strap across his chest. He whispered to himself, too low for anyone else to hear, "Soon, very soon." That thought carried him forward through pain and through silence toward the trial that waited just beyond the tree-line dot. The forest was thick with silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, broken only by the soft creak of saddles and the crunch of boots pressing against fallen leaves. The hunters moved cautiously through the undergrowth, their voices hushed now as though the trees themselves were listening. Ethan felt the air shift, heavier, charged with the unseen presence of something wild. His breath slowed, his senses sharpened. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. From the brush ahead came a violent crash, branches snapping like brittle bones, earth tearing beneath something massive. The men froze, eyes wide, hands tightening on rifles. Out from the shadows surged a wild boar, larger than any Ethan had ever seen. Its body was a wall of muscle and bristle, its tusks curved like sharpened hooks that caught the glint of sunlight as it charged forward. The ground shook beneath its hooves, clods of dirt flying, the beast roaring with raw fury as it ripped through the clearing. It must have weighed over 400 pounds, a nightmare of power and instinct combined. The cowboys scattered, fear breaking their line. One of the seasoned marksmen, a man known for boasting about never missing, raised his rifle with trembling hands. The shot cracked through the trees, echoing loud enough to scatter birds into the sky, but the bullet found only bark. The boar swerved, unhurt, its rage only growing. Panic gripped the group. Horses reared, men cursed under their breath, some stumbling back toward the safety of the tree line. Dust and leaves churned in the chaos. Ethan didn't move. His boots rooted themselves to the earth, his eyes locked on the beast as it tore at the ground, tusks gouging deep scars into the soil. He could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, the weight of the moment pressing down like the provisions sack he had carried for miles. This was it, the test he had been waiting for, the moment no man could fake, the chance his father's words had prepared him for. He heard them as clearly as if they were spoken now, steady and calm against the storm of fear around him. Strength isn't in muscle, son, it's in the heart. Don't give up. Not now. Not ever. The men around him shouted, their voices cracked with panic, but to Ethan they were only echoes. The world narrowed to the beast and the steady rise and fall of his own chest. He gripped the rifle in his hands, the wood rough but familiar against his palms. He had no time to think of how thin his arms were, or of the laughter that had followed him since the day he set foot in Dusterville. All that mattered was this: he would not run, he would not be the coward they expected. The boar snorted, pawing the earth, its eyes wild with fury. For an instant everything slowed. Ethan felt the fire in his chest flare, courage born not of pride but of resolve. His father had survived storms that broke stronger men. Ethan would survive this. As the beast lowered its head for another charge, Ethan took one deliberate step forward instead of back. Dust swirled at his feet, his shoulders squared, his heartbeat thundered, but his hands steadied. Around him, men stumbled in disbelief. To them, the sight was madness. The skinny cowboy, the one they had mocked as a skeleton in boots, standing unflinching before a monster that outweighed him 5 times over. But to Ethan, it was clarity. This was the chance he had promised himself, the moment when the laughter would die. He knew he might fall, but if he did, it would be facing forward. That thought alone gave him strength beyond his frame. The boar let out a piercing cry and charged, dirt exploding beneath its hooves. Ethan exhaled once, steady and slow, and raised his weapon. In that breath, every memory of ridicule, every word of doubt, every weight he had carried turned into fuel. He was no longer the outsider dragging behind the others. He was his father's son, armed with nothing but resolve, standing in the path of fear itself. And in that instant he chose not to surrender. The air split with the roar of the charging boar, its massive frame barreling forward like a storm-given flesh. The ground trembled beneath its hooves, each step shaking loose clods of dirt and scattering leaves into the air. For a heartbeat it seemed unstoppable, a wall of muscle and fury crashing through the clearing. Every man in that hunting party knew what such a beast could do if it reached its target. Yet none moved to meet it. They shouted, they scrambled, they stumbled back in fear. All but one. Ethan's body reacted before thought could intervene. With a sharp intake of breath, he pivoted to the side, boots digging into the soil as he hurled himself clear of the tusks. The world blurred, a rush of heat and dust sweeping across his vision as the boar thundered past, so close he could feel the violent air pushed from its charge. His shoulder slammed against the earth, but his hands never let go of the rifle. In one fluid motion born not of training but of sheer determination, he rolled to his knee, raised the weapon, and aimed. The boar turned, its wild eyes fixed on him, foam flecking its tusks as it wheeled for another assault. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the clearing, a crack that echoed off every tree and silenced every shout. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he held firm, eyes locked on the beast as the bullet struck home. The impact was immediate. The boar staggered, its momentum faltering as the round tore into its side. A guttural roar of pain burst from its throat, a sound so raw it seemed to shake the very branches above. It tried to push forward, legs churning with desperate strength, but the wound stole its force. With one final heave, the massive creature collapsed to the ground, dust exploding outward in a cloud that drifted slowly over the stunned hunters. Then came silence. The men who had mocked Ethan only hours before stood frozen, their rifles half raised, their mouths half open. None of them had expected it, not from him. The skinny stranger they called a skeleton in boots, the boy they thought too fragile for the trail, had just brought down a 400-pound monster with a single decisive act. The weight of the moment hung heavy over the clearing. Even the birds, startled by the shot, had not yet dared return their calls. Ethan lowered the rifle slowly, his chest heaving, sweat streaking through the dust on his face. His eyes scanned the still form of the boar, then lifted toward the circle of men around him. For the first time since he had arrived in Dusterville, their gazes held something different. No smirks, no laughter, no easy dismissal. Instead, there was a flicker of respect, small, cautious, but undeniable. They had witnessed a truth none could ignore. When the moment demanded courage, Ethan had not faltered. Roy Bennett's grin was gone. He tried to mask his unease with a shrug, but his eyes betrayed him, narrowing with a mix of disbelief and something sharper, resentment. Roy had built his reputation on strength, on being the man others followed. Yet here stood Ethan, rail-thin and ridiculed, who had done what no one else dared in that instant. The hunters began to murmur, voices low and uncertain, as though afraid to break the fragile silence too quickly. Tom Harris, the old cowboy who had watched Ethan closely, gave the faintest nod, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Ethan returned it with a slight dip of his head, but inside he felt no triumph, no swelling pride. Only the steady rhythm of his father's words beating through him. Strength is in the heart. Yet even as the air shifted, as that first fragile strand of respect was spun between him and the others, Ethan knew this was not the end. Bringing the beast down had silenced their laughter for now, but in Dusterville, one act was never enough. Respect here was not won in a single moment. It had to be carried, proven, endured. The true test, he realized, was only beginning. And as his gaze settled once more on the fallen boar, a new weight settled on his shoulders. He had stepped forward, yes. But the road ahead demanded more than one bullet, more than one act of defiance. It demanded everything he had left to give. The clearing still smelled of gunpowder and dust when the laughter finally faded into an uneasy quiet. The massive body of the boar lay stretched across the ground, its dark hide heaving with the last echoes of the hunt. The men, once so quick with jokes, now circled the fallen beast with cautious steps, each one knowing what the next task would demand. Roy Bennett stood at the edge, his usual smirk absent, his brow furrowed as he looked from the lifeless animal to the faces of his companions. "Well," he muttered, his voice carrying a grudging edge, "who's going to carry it?" His tone was sharp, but beneath it was hesitation. Everyone knew the weight of the challenge. The hog was enormous, far beyond the strength of one man to bear easily. Even the strongest cowboys among them, broad-shouldered and hardened by years of labor, shifted uncomfortably at the thought. The silence stretched. No one volunteered. They exchanged glances, searching for a practical solution. Yet each man hesitated. For all their bravado, the reality of lifting such a burden turned their confidence into caution. Roy's gaze flicked from one man to another, frustration simmering, until it landed finally on Ethan Cole. Thin, dust-streaked, and still catching his breath from the shot that had silenced the clearing, Ethan stood apart from the group. He said nothing, only removed his worn hat with a slow motion and dragged a sleeve across his brow to wipe away the sweat. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. He crouched beside the boar, his eyes tracing the massive form, and set his hands against the rough hide. The others stared, some with disbelief, others with hidden curiosity. Tom Harris, leaning against a tree with arms crossed, broke the silence with a rough voice that carried more concern than ridicule. "You're not thinking of lifting that, are you, boy?" His brows lifted, his tone edged with warning. "That beast outweighs you 3 times over." Ethan glanced up at him briefly, his expression calm, then returned his focus to the task at hand. There was no bravado in his eyes, no need for grand declarations, only determination. He shifted his stance, dug his boots into the dirt, and with a steady motion began to heave the animal upward. Muscles in his back and shoulders strained to their limit, his lean frame trembling as the full weight pressed down on him. Dust rose around his boots as he staggered beneath the load. For a breathless moment it seemed impossible, and several of the men leaned forward as though to intervene. But then, with a soundless resolve, Ethan straightened. The boar's bulk settled across his shoulders, crushingly heavy, yet balanced by sheer willpower. His knees shook, his arms locked tight against the weight, and sweat poured down his face. He wavered for a heartbeat, the strain threatening to force him down, but instead of falling, he took one step forward. Just one step, but it was enough to turn the entire clearing silent. The hunters froze where they stood. The man they had mocked as frail, the newcomer they had labeled unfit, was carrying the impossible on his back. The boar hung like a mountain across his shoulders, and yet he moved. One deliberate stride cutting through the disbelief in their eyes. The step was not graceful, not easy, but it carried with it more strength than any boast or victory cry. It was a step carved from endurance, from the lessons of hardship that only Ethan himself understood. Tom exhaled slowly, a note of reluctant awe in his breath. "I'll be," he whispered, though the rest of his words faded, drowned by the stunned silence. Roy said nothing at all. His jaw tightened, his pride challenged in a way no joke could mask. For the first time, Ethan had not just silenced their laughter, he had taken command of it, reshaping it into something heavier, something they all felt in their chests. Respect, begrudging, and undeniable. And with that first step, the journey of many more began. Each stride would test him, each moment would threaten to buckle his knees. But Ethan had made his choice. He would carry the weight dot. Each step was a battle. The boar's massive weight bore down on Ethan like a mountain, pressing into his shoulders until his spine felt as though it might give way. Fire licked across his back, muscles stretched and strained beyond their limit, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts, as every breath came harder than the last. Pain surged with every movement, sharp and unrelenting, but Ethan did not falter. He staggered forward, boots sinking into the soft forest floor, dust rising in small clouds beneath his steps. His body screamed for release, begged him to drop the burden and collapse into the dirt, but his heart held stronger than his bones. He would not stop. Behind him, the other cowboys followed in silence. At first, they had expected him to fail quickly. Surely, they thought, the skinny newcomer would stumble within moments, crushed under the weight of the animal he had been foolish enough to lift. They had braced themselves for the sound of defeat, for the sight of him dropping to his knees and admitting weakness. But minute by minute, step by step, Ethan kept moving. The forest grew darker as the canopy swallowed the morning sun, and still he pressed forward. Sweat rolled into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he blinked it away and kept his focus on the narrow trail ahead. His breaths came in harsh pulls, every exhale escaping like steam from a furnace. Yet there was no anger in his stride. He wasn't driven by bitterness toward their laughter. That fire had already burned away. What pushed him now was something deeper, quieter, and far more powerful, the promise he had made to himself. He had to prove, not to Roy, not to the men watching, but to his own heart, that he was more than they believed, that the strength his father had spoken of was real and that it lived in him. Every meter felt longer than the last. His legs shook with exhaustion, his boots dragging, his shoulders raw beneath the crushing load. Pain wrapped around him like chains, but through it all he found rhythm. One step, then another. Forward, always forward. The hunters, once restless and impatient, grew quiet as they watched. Their smirks had faded long ago, replaced first with surprise, then with something heavier. Tom Harris walked a little closer, his eyes never leaving Ethan's back. In all his years on the trail, he had seen men break under far less. Yet here was the boy they had called frail, carrying the impossible without a word of complaint. There was no boast on Ethan's lips, no demand for acknowledgement, only the steady silence of a man determined to endure. And that silence spoke louder than anything Roy or the others had ever shouted. Slowly, the mood of the group began to shift. Where once there had been scorn, now there was a quiet respect forming in their eyes. They began to realize that what they were witnessing was not madness or foolish pride. It was resolve. Ethan was showing them a kind of strength they could not mock, because it was not born of muscle or swagger, but of sheer willpower. The forest echoed with the sound of his labored breaths, each one proof that he refused to surrender. As the trail wound deeper between the trees, the men fell further into silence, their laughter gone, replaced by awe. The figure before them, bent but unbroken beneath the weight of the beast, no longer looked like the fragile stranger they had doubted. He looked like something more, like a man carrying not just a boar, but every insult, every jeer, every shadow of doubt they had cast upon him. and turning it all into proof that he could not be broken. Step by step, their contempt was fading, and in its place grew something they never thought they would feel toward Ethan Cole: admiration. The sun had risen high above the trees by the time Ethan stumbled into camp, every step of the last miles etched into the lines of his body. 2 long hours he had carried the impossible weight, his legs trembling, his back screaming with pain, his shirt plastered to him with sweat and dirt. Dust clung to his skin, streaked with mud where he had slipped against the uneven trail, but still he moved forward, never letting the burden fall until the familiar glow of campfires came into view. The hunters who had returned ahead of him turned at the sound of boots dragging across the ground. Their conversation stopped mid-sentence. Their laughter stilled. All eyes locked on the figure emerging from the shadows of the trees, thin, bent under a monstrous load but unbroken. Ethan staggered toward the fire, his breath ragged, each inhale sharp as though it might tear his lungs apart. At last, he bent his knees and eased the weight from his shoulders. With controlled care, he lowered the great boar down onto the packed earth beside the flames. The heavy thud of its body striking the ground echoed through camp, final and undeniable. Then came silence. No one dared laugh, for there was nothing left to mock. The moment hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Roy Bennett shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he looked anywhere but at Ethan. The words that usually came so quickly to him, sharp, cutting, meant to keep him above the others, refused to rise. He clenched his fists, but no jeer could cover what everyone had just seen. For the first time, his power in the group felt smaller, diminished under the weight of a truth he couldn't twist. The man he had ridiculed had done what none of them could. Tom Harris stepped forward, his boots slow and steady on the hard ground. He stopped beside Ethan, who stood with his shoulders bowed, chest heaving, his hat still in hand. For a moment Tom studied him, the silence stretching long enough for the younger man to lift his eyes. Then Tom reached out, his hand rough with age, and clapped it firmly on Ethan's shoulder. "Now you're a cowboy, son," he said, his voice low but carrying through the camp like a bell. The words struck deeper than any cheer. They were not spoken out of pity nor out of surprise, but with the weight of recognition. Around the fire the other men met Ethan's eyes, and though none spoke, their gazes told the rest. The mockery that had trailed him since his arrival was gone. In its place was something he had bled for, sweated for, endured humiliation for: respect, hard-earned, undeniable respect. Ethan nodded once, too exhausted for more, but inside his chest, the fire that had carried him through the trial settled into something steady and quiet. He had not lifted that beast for their applause. He had done it to prove to himself that he was not the weak figure they believed. And now, as the men looked at him with a new measure in their eyes, he knew his father's words had been true all along. Strength wasn't in the size of a man's frame, but in the endurance of his heart. And in that moment, Ethan Cole had earned his place among them. That night the fire crackled low, its glow flickering across weary faces gathered in a quiet circle. The air was different now. No bursts of laughter, no whispered jokes aimed at the thin newcomer. Instead, silence carried its own weight, broken only by the steady crackle of burning wood. Ethan sat apart, his hat resting on his knee, the shadows deepening the sharp lines of his tired face. His body was worn, every muscle aching from the trial of the day, yet in his eyes burned a calm strength no one dared challenge. The men around the fire glanced at him, not with scorn, but with something that had been absent before: respect. He had not won their regard with size or force. He had won it by carrying a burden that should have broken him, by proving that endurance and resolve could outlast doubt and ridicule. In that quiet, Ethan became something more than just another ranch hand. He became a symbol, a reminder that true strength came not from muscle, but from the will to rise when others expected you to fall. In the days that followed, his story began to spread. When new settlers rode into Dusterville and asked about the land, the cattle, and the men who worked it, someone would always tell the tale of the skinny cowboy who carried a 400-pound boar on his back. They told it with pride, with a sense of awe, as if repeating a lesson carved into the very soil. And the lesson was always the same. In these lands, strength was not measured by the body, but by the heart.